you very much for having me today. Yeah, I'm a Canadian philosopher and psychoanalyst, and I'm also a retired clinical psychologist now. But I do a variety of teaching and supervising, and I'm an honorary professor at the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex. So I'm going to talk about a topic that I didn't realize that Dr. Rubin had also submitted the same title. I took mine from Charles Bronson's movie, The Evil That Men Do. So let me get into this, and I look forward to a discussion. Einstein approached Freud on behalf of the League of Nations and asked the question, is there any way of delivering mankind from the curse of war? Freud responded with reservation, suggesting that perhaps it may only be mitigated. This is the general tenor of his anthropological treatment of humanity. Until base instinct, or trieb, is sufficiently harnessed and transformed in the service of reason, our world communities will continue to be plagued by the dark marauders of our own insidious nature. Why war? Because hate and violence are, quote, a piece of unconquerable nature, a piece of our own psychical constitution, end quote. With this dismal portrait of human relations, we may never come to throw our hatred down. People are slaughtering one another all over the world in the name of religion, ethnic purity, and nationalism under the guise of freedom, justice, ethical duty, and social reform. Within the past few decades alone, contemporary ethno-political warfare has raged throughout the strife-torn territories of the Middle East, Africa, Eastern Europe, South and East Asia, Central and South America, Russia, and the Ukraine, where civilian populations are the primary targets of terror, marked by sadism and butchery, while women and children comprise a large percentage of the incurred human rights atrocities. Those close to the front lines of ethnic and religious conflicts are oppressed by political violence, from refugees who have lost their families to ethnic cleansing campaigns or terrorist persecutions, to civilians who must dodge sniper fire every day to run to the market to fetch a loaf of bread. When the constancy of violence, horror, and war continues to saturate our daily consciousness, we can only anticipate where it will emerge next. To what degree will our disparate cultures be able to rise above this mode of existence when violence becomes the right of a community, either chosen or impugned? This is further compounded by the historical fact that brutality was the driving force behind the emergence of law, which still requires the use of violence to be enforced. Can actual force be replaced by the force of ideas, or are we condemned to the perversions of pathos? Given Freud's ontological treatise on the structure of the psyche, quote, there is no use in trying to get rid of men's aggressive inclinations, end quote. They are as natural as breathing. For we can never escape from the fact that our minds are primitive. Homo homini lupus est, man is a wolf to man. The history of the human race is forged on traumatization, resentment, and the need for revenge, which preoccupies collective human consciousness and fuels pathological enactments. Aggression and violence directed toward others is part of human nature, an insidious derivative of our pathos. For the Greeks, to be human is to suffer, to be susceptible to pain, to endure illness. In short, our accruing pathology. Our pathos may even become fused with a desire, as in antipathy, a passion, pathia, against, anti, another. Mental illness stems from this basic constituency of mind. This is why Freud observed that we are all neurotic, that is, ill, whereby the human aspect is saturated with anxiety, suffering, and despair. It's just a matter of degree. We are all deeply affected by our pathos, to the point that what truly differentiates individuals and societies from one another is our level of functionality and adaptation to psychic pain. In other words, human pathology is normative throughout all cultures and all times. Being normal is merely another word for pathos. Psychopathology is the essence of man, and it is from this standpoint that all else shall be measured. Desire precedes and supersedes reason, for primitive forces govern the psyche. They are arguably responsible as well for the exalted achievements of reason itself. Irrationality, pathos, is our primordial being, and it is from this ontological ground that all else materializes and makes itself known through various forms of human enactments. We are a world divided by race, religion, ethnicity, economics, politics, and culture, where strong emotional bonds fuel and sustain separation and difference among our communities. I do not wish to express platitudes, illusory ideals, or provide false hope. The evidence, the brute facticity of impoverishment, suffering, cruel, and murder points to the most archaic configurations of psychic development that permeate our valuation practices. Within today's multicultural world community, differences and prejudices continue to divide and polarize human relations into firm oppositions that become fortified within rigid group identifications that inform collectively shared value systems. What I mean by prejudice is that human beings are inclined toward the preferential self-expression of valuation based on self-interest and self-valuation, whether explicit or implicit, or based in unconscious bias. Ethnic, religious, cultural, and national identities are forged through prejudicial valuation practices. In some cases, even legitimate heinous forms of injustice, such as genocide, terrorism, human enslavement, and child trafficking, just to name a few. When collective identity is so firmly established in bipolar relation to the other, it is possible for such valuation practice to abate under the rubric of peace. Prejudice, hate, and violence are no more likely to disappear than the reality of the external world. Therefore, the question becomes one of amelioration. In group psychology and the analysis of the ego, Freud underscores the universality of prejudice. And I'm going to quote, "Every time two families become connected by marriage, each of them thinks of itself superior to or better birth than the other. Of two neighboring towns, each is other's most jealous rival. Every little canton looks down upon the others with contempt. Closely related races keep one another at arm's length. The South German cannot endure the North German. The Englishman casts every kind of aspersion upon the Scot. The Spaniard despises the Portuguese. We are no longer astonished that greater differences could lead to an almost insuperable repugnance. such as the Gallic people for the German, the Aryan for the Semite, and the white races for the colored. That's end quote. Now, this is a profound observation that equally applies today. Regardless of our era of diversity, multiculturalism, tolerance for difference, interethnic, interfaith, interracial, and social pluralism, a super signifier of judgment is always unconsciously operative based on the identification of similarity and difference that infiltrates every form of prejudice and ideology. There is such a narcissism of even minor differences between individuals and cultures that the very sound of rap music blaring from an open car window could lead one so judgmentally inclined to conclude that the true meaning of culture is to be found growing in the bottom of a petri dish. We are further informed by scientists that we now have the empirical means by which to measure the degree and intensity of our disgust for minor differences by observing the pupil size of an individual. It is the universal biological fact that regardless of light differences, our pupils dilate when we like something and become pinpricks when we perceive something to be a repellent. It's comforting to know that when uncertain about whether someone is friend or foe, all you have to do is look at the center of their iris to determine if it's the size of a pinhead. The nature of identification has its origin in early self-development and socialization, whereby the child takes its parents as ambivalent and ideal objects, who, along with their value systems, become internalized within personality formation and affect the germination of moral conscience, as well as the capacities for love and hate. Whether personal or collective, identity is defined in opposition to difference and identification with similarity. But we also realize that identification is overdetermined, multiply instantiated, and based on a plurality of forces and indecisive attitudes that inform how the objects, content, form, valence, qualia, and intensity of identifications are constituted. The structural dynamic alone may be said to account for the need for division, uniqueness, and prejudicial self-preferences as opposed to others who stand in marked difference, but it also potentially explains the dialectical complementarities at play on other unconscious levels. Nevertheless, the confluence of destructive and self-preservative forces compounds the nature of identifications and social relations, where desire justifies murder and reason is manipulated to assuage primal instinctual urges in the service of narcissistic pursuits. The polarity of human desire, the nature of personal and collective identifications, and the combative forces of social and cultural oppositions all operate within anthropologically systemic, socio-symbolic, ontological structures that give rise to civilization and the historical manifestations of pathology. For the sake of parsimony, let us simply refer to this as a dialectical process of mutual opposition that is simultaneously operative and implicative at any given moment within civilization. Civilization, even more so than nature itself, is responsible for most of our malaise, but it's also responsible for our remarkable advances in education, technology, science, medicine, human rights, aesthetics, and moral conscientiousness. that enhance the quality of human life, social progress that has not, for the most part, that has, for the most part, occurred in our lifetime. But along with these advances have also come the technology to extinguish the entire human race, either by intentional design, human errors, computer malfunctioning, superintelligence AI, or by accident. This is especially disturbing when fanatical and paranoid minds have means and access to weapons of mass destruction. This places us in the precarious position of attempting to anticipate the possible fate of humanity, for the predictive validity of the progression of civilization hinges on whether aggression and violence will be restricted, displaced, inverted, and or sublimated for higher rational, ethical, and aesthetic spiritual pursuits. Although Steven Pinker has made a valid point, despite virulent criticism, that violence has declined on a mass scale from earlier times in human history, he seems to gloss over the fact that this does not mitigate the existential risks of probable future aggressive actions by religious fanatics, despots, nation states, group collectives, fringe extremists, lone wolves, or machines that could be more catastrophic in scope and than previous periods in the trek of human civilization due to advances in technology, ideological clashes, economic disparities, international threats to enterprise and peace, inter and intra-group political and ethnic tensions within nations, and fundamentalist religious zealots and terrorists hell-bent on wreaking unprecedented havoc throughout the world. Regarding the question of the possibility of global amelioration of pathological enactments, the issue becomes one of degree. Since prehistory, culture has undergone an evolutionary process of becoming, which is responsible for what we have come to call civilization, namely our evolved contemporary valuation practices. However, as Freud observed, quote, uncultivated races and backward strata of the population are already multiplying more rapidly than highly cultivated ones, end quote. What this means in contemporary parlance is that the poor, uneducated, disenfranchised, oppressed, economically challenged, and displaced factions of society are having more children born into the same socially impoverished conditions that lead to future repetitions of deprivation, oppression, and austerity, which informs new successive generations who, of course, will go on to have their own children in a perpetual transgenerational transmission of hardship and suffering. Although there are many socioeconomic, political, and psychological reasons for this, they nevertheless obstruct the optimal transformation of our pathos. Prejudice forms a basic constituency in our psychic constitutions, for we all pass judgments on others based on our preferential appraisal of what we value and are accustomed to find familiar and or pleasing. The dialectical tension between difference and similarity carries a certain psychological hold over people, for our earliest familiar identifications are based in shared experiences and values, and we gravitate toward those to whom we feel attracted due to communal affiliation and shared meaning. But the double edge of the dialectic, as negativity resulting in a higher unity, exposes us to a dilemma. For the dialectic is the ontological dynamic underlying prejudice itself. Here we may be reminded of Adorno. The dark side of the negative is always emphasized in any act of judgment. In fact, it is the structural edifice for judgment to exist. Most societies need to have enemies. That is, they need to have an emotional whipping boy or designated scapegoat to beat and project all of their inner conflicts, frustrations, hate, rage, and homicidal fantasies onto. Otherwise, we would never have invented poetics, theater, drama, the arts, music, religion, politics, and so on. For the human psychic requires forms of displacement and sublimation to transform inner discord, affect, and ambivalent experience into palatable outlets so we may psychologically function and adapt to real, perceived, or felt adversity. If we didn't have these psychological capacities and unconscious tendencies, we'd all be basket cases. The reality of racism, ethnic discrimination, interethnic rivalries, and hostilities, micro-competitions and devaluations within subcultures and fringe subgroups, and prejudicial feelings cast onto objects of alterity are all too human universal propensities. To deny them would be an incredulous attempt at posturing political correctness in favor of truth. The mass contempt in many nations for immigrants, refugees, migrant workers, and asylum seekers of different ethnic and national persuasions, even if only a minority view, speaks to the underground psychic reality of human prejudice, worried that the other will steal their chickens, jobs, sexual partners, and enjoyment. A recent example of this is a mob of more than 1,000 South Africans that raided a Somali neighborhood in Pretoria, killing foreign African settlers based on a hate campaign against foreigners, immigrants, and refugees who are accused of creating unemployment and increasing crime. Here, the foreigner is transferentially constructed as the elected evil other who will mooch, plunder, and soak up the citizenry's pleasures and deprive them of their national birthrights and liberties, and who, moreover, are left flipping the bill for the outsider to enjoy a free lunch. Keep that piece of shit out of my country. This is a common visceral opinion among many American, British, and European communities, to such a degree that the immigrant, migrant worker, or refugee should be deprived of subsidy, welfare, food stamps, unemployment insurance, access to health care, education, daycare, and other privileges just because of their foreign status or so-called lack of entitlement to free services on the government's dime. This exclusionary phenomenon speaks to both the individual and collective rupture of feelings of security and safety that are perceived to be imperiled when political changes occur in social strata and potential emergent threats manifest. A paranoid, schizoid, and/or panicky hysterical process lies at the very heart of human psychological motivations, as it would be illogical not to fear what is unknown and unfamiliar for what is domestic, customary, and familiar. Here the other is categorically, dispositionally constituted, even if there are no discernible threats. A difference signifies its own meaning based on dissimilarity, fear, and potential personal loss and sacrifice of a country's members or their own kind. Here, the personal idiosyncrasy of selective identification with a certain element of one's culture, language, nationalism, or social complex can wreak political consequences. And even when altruistic and humanistic movements prevail, a spoiler is always introduced based on human frailty, desperation, and the inevitability of pathological enactments. When German citizens protested over the Syrian and North African migrants who allegedly robbed, looted, and sexually assaulted the women after being graciously accepted into their country during the 2015 refugee crisis, which of course happens every day, everywhere, regardless of where you come from, not to mention several US governors refusing to allow refugees to settle in their home states once it was discovered that ISIS connections were part of the Paris attacks based on refugee involvement. It's no surprise that panic would set in and the floodgates would be closed based on mass protest. These events even sparked President Donald Trump to ban Muslims, as everybody knows, from entering the US and to build a wall on the border of Mexico to keep out the, quote, illegal freeloaders, only to later separate migrant children from their mothers and callously throw them into detention cages, alone and estranged from any familiar and emotional comfort. Here it becomes obvious that the foreign, unknown, alien other, who have their own needs, desires, adversity, and trauma, will likely have their own, quote, psychological baggage and material losses that other nation states will have to pay for. And this is likely how a large percentage of the populace thinks. Why else would people get so emotionally bent out of shape by an influx of new people into their country? The fear of so-called hardworking citizens supporting and taking care of foreigners on their sweat and taxes, where food, shelter, transport, economic subsidies, and entertainment, such as access to TVs, cell phones, and computers and the internet, are given away without merit, even in the spirit of humanitarian aid, spurs bad feelings among the working class and rich alike. Who wants a dependent child when you never wanted to get pregnant to begin with? So I will be closing my talk in a minute. Part of the problem facing us is that prejudice is ontologically constituted in the most rudimentary aspects of human consciousness as psychological disposition. Like the nature of the dialectic, prejudice has both negative and positive valences. While violence and destruction are the instruments of prejudice, so too are caring and love. Prejudice is not merely a negative construct. Prejudice defines our valuation practices, which are the mecca of individual and communal life. Rather than conceive of prejudice as simply a pathological anomaly, prejudice is also responsible for our most revered ideals. As I've said previously, prejudice in its essence is the preferential self-expression of valuation, as corrupt as that may be.